You know, right now we're even more popular than we were when we were on network TV because we're shown all around the world. And now because of TikTok and the internet, more people are watching our show than ever before.
They made us laugh out loud. They kept us glued to our screens, and they turned a Detroit pawn shop into one of the most watched shows on television. The cast of Hardcore Pawn became like family to millions of devoted fans around the world. But not every familiar face is still with us today. Some of these beloved stars left this world in the most tragic and heartbreaking of circumstances, leaving fans completely devastated. Who did we lose along the way? How did their stories end? These are 10 members who sadly passed away. Number 6 is the most heartbreaking. Rich Pyle, the manager who became too popular. Before the cameras ever arrived, Rich Pyle was already a familiar face inside American Jewelry and Loan, and he had been for 25 years. Long before any television crew showed up, Rich was coming in every single day, doing his job and keeping things running smoothly. He was not flashy or loud. He was simply reliable. And in a place as wild and unpredictable as that pawn shop, that kind of reliability meant everything. When Hardcore Pawn launched and millions of people started watching every week, Rich became something that nobody had seen coming. He became a fan favorite. While Les Gold was screaming, Ashley was arguing, and Seth was pushing everyone's buttons, Rich stayed calm and steady, and viewers absolutely loved him for it. Online forums praised him, social media celebrated him, and for the very first time in his long career, total strangers were recognizing his face on the street. But that recognition reportedly started changing things behind the scenes, and not in a good way. People close to the production began describing a shift in Rich's attitude as the show grew more popular, suggesting that the calm and reliable manager everyone appreciated was starting to carry himself very differently. Whether the fame had genuinely changed him or whether years of frustration had simply been building up inside, the tension between Rich and Les Gold allegedly kept growing until it was impossible to ignore. Things eventually reached a breaking point, and Rich was placed on probation as a final warning. Most people in that position would have taken it seriously, but Rich did not survive it, and he was fired from the very shop he had dedicated 25 years of his life to. The dismissal was not quiet or private either. It played out in a way that loyal viewers watched with complete shock, because the man who had always seemed untouchable had suddenly lost everything. Rich briefly picked up work hosting a show called Meltdown, and for a moment it looked like a promising new beginning. But the show faded quickly, the attention dried up, and Rich gradually disappeared from public life almost completely. No major interviews followed, no television comeback ever came. And the man who had once been the calm center of one of cable television's wildest shows simply walked away and never looked back. His story was a quiet warning that almost nobody noticed at the time, but the next disappearance was far more dramatic, and it played out in front of millions of watching eyes. Christina Silas, the employee erased after one mistake. Not everyone on Hardcore Pawn was loud or dramatic or constantly in the middle of some big argument, and Christina Silas was living proof of that. Viewers knew her face from the front counter.
4 best friends to Miami, party at the sugar factory, ride in a Rolls-Royce and start a brand new line of amazing products.
But she was never the center of any major storyline, never caught up in the screaming matches that made the show so famous, and never demanding attention for herself. She was quiet, dependable, and easy to overlook, which is exactly why what eventually happened to her felt so completely shocking when it finally came. Christina had built her entire reputation inside that shop on something very simple. She showed up, she did her work, and she never caused problems. In an environment as unpredictable and explosive as American Jewelry and Loan, that kind of quiet steadiness was genuinely valuable. Even if the cameras rarely pointed in her direction. She was the kind of person the whole operation depended on without anyone ever really stopping to think about it. A reliable piece of the shop that just worked. Then came season 8, and everything fell apart in the worst possible way. Christina was caught stealing, and the details were not complicated or easy to misunderstand. This was not a backstage rumor that got quietly managed by the production team. It was not something the Golds decided to protect her from. It aired on national television in front of an audience of millions of people who had spent years watching her stand behind that counter looking completely trustworthy. The moment that episode went out, everything she had carefully built was gone in an instant. What made her situation especially brutal was just how permanent it all became, because reality television has a way of freezing the worst moments forever. A private mistake can eventually be forgiven and slowly forgotten, but a mistake made on camera and broadcast into living rooms across the entire country becomes a permanent record that anyone can find. Christina's worst moment was not just witnessed by millions, it was archived and searchable, waiting there for anyone who ever looked up her name. After the scandal, she simply vanished. Fans stopped mentioning her. The show moved on without any visible acknowledgement of the gap she had left, and nobody offered any public comment or explanation about what came next for her. One mistake, one camera, and years of quiet reliability suddenly meant nothing at all. But the next story had no scandal attached to it, just hardship that arrived quietly and took everything anyway. Felix Tykeman, the silent security guard. Felix Tykeman was never the loudest person in the room, and he never needed to be, because he had something that most people on that show did not. He had presence. He worked security for 6 full seasons of Hardcore Pawn, long enough to become one of the most consistently recognizable faces the entire show ever produced, and viewers knew him by his huge beard before they even learned his name. He felt solid and permanent, like someone who had always been there and always would be. Unlike some of his colleagues, Felix never seemed to be performing for the cameras or chasing dramatic moments to get more screen time. He was doing a job, and he did it the exact same steady way every single time the cameras rolled, which made him genuinely trustworthy in the eyes of viewers at home. He was one of the very few people inside that building who never looked like he was one bad day away from completely losing control, and in a show that was almost entirely built around chaos, that made Felix something rare and valuable. What happened to Felix after Hardcore Pawn ended had absolutely nothing to do with scandal or bad behavior, because he did not get caught stealing. He was not fired in front of a national audience, and he did not leave behind any public drama for people to gossip about. Instead, he ran straight into the kind of problems that simply do not care whether someone has been on television or not. Severe health struggles reportedly hit him hard in the years that followed the show, and serious financial difficulties came right behind them, making the rebuilding process far harder than anyone watching from the outside could have imagined. At some point, Felix made the decision to leave Detroit entirely and relocate to Austin, Texas, putting real distance between himself and the city where he had spent years working under the lights of a reality television production. Whether that move was about finding a fresh start or simply about surviving day to day is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that he did not go looking for attention when he got there. No interviews came out of Austin, no social media presence appeared, no public appearances followed, and Felix Tykeman, a man who had stood in front of millions of viewers for 6 straight seasons, became almost impossible to find. He did not disappear in disgrace or leave behind a scandal. He simply walked away from a world that had stopped offering him anything worth staying for. And the next person to vanish had been there even longer than Felix, building the whole thing before the cameras ever switched on. Lily Gold, the woman removed from the story. Long before Hardcore Pawn became a television phenomenon, long before the cameras and the crew and the millions of weekly viewers, Lily Gold was already there. She had helped build American Jewelry and Loan into the institution it became, working alongside her husband Les through the years when the shop was just a local business trying to survive in Detroit. She was not a late addition to the story, she was part of the foundation, and that made what eventually happened to her all the more difficult to understand. When the show launched, Lily appeared during Season 1 as the office manager, a role that reflected how deeply embedded she was in the day-to-day running of the business. She was not performing for cameras or trying to carve out a personality for television audiences. She was simply doing what she had always done, keeping things organized and holding the operation together from the inside. Viewers who paid attention noticed her, appreciated her steady presence, and assumed she would be a permanent fixture throughout the entire run of the show. Then she stopped appearing, and nobody explained why. There was no dramatic exit scene, no tearful farewell, no public statement from the Gold family addressing her absence. One season she was there, and the next she simply was not. And the show continued rolling forward as though she had never been a significant part of it at all. For casual viewers, it was easy to miss. But for fans who had followed the show closely from the beginning, the gap was obvious, and the silence surrounding it felt strange and uncomfortable. Rumors began filling the space that explanations refused to occupy. Some suggested that the behind-the-scenes family dynamics had become genuinely exhausting for Lily, that the pressure of running a real business while simultaneously producing a reality television show had taken a serious emotional toll on her. Others pointed to the natural tension that comes when private family life gets pulled into a very public format, suggesting that Lily may have simply reached a point where the cameras were no longer something she was willing to live alongside. Whatever the real reason, the result was the same. The woman who had invested years of her life building the very business that the show was built around was quietly moved out of frame, her contributions fading into the background while the production continued without her. She was never fired on television, never caught in a scandal, and never gave anyone a reason to push her out, which somehow made her disappearance feel more unsettling than all the others. But the next person to vanish never even had a name for viewers to search, and somehow that made them even more impossible to forget. The guitar man, the viral customer, nobody identified. Most people who walked through the doors of American Jewelry and Loan came in with something to sell and left with either money or disappointment. And the cameras captured hundreds of those transactions across the years the show was running. But every once in a while, somebody walked in and created a moment so completely unexpected that it stopped being just a television scene and became something the internet refused to let go of. And the man that fans eventually started calling the Guitar Man was exactly that kind of moment. He came in carrying a guitar and a problem that had nothing to do with music. He needed money, reportedly to pay for a DNA test, and the guitar was the only thing he had to offer in exchange. The negotiation that followed did not go well for anyone involved, with the two sides unable to agree on a price that felt fair, and the tension in the room building steadily with every exchange until it became clear that no deal was going to happen that day. What happened next was the part that nobody saw coming and nobody forgot. Instead of walking back out the door with his guitar and his frustration, the man lifted the instrument and smashed it directly onto the floor of the shop, shattering it completely in one of the most dramatically unexpected moments the show ever captured on camera. It was loud, it was shocking, and it was over in seconds, but the cameras caught every single frame of it, and those frames turned out to be worth more than anything he had ever hoped to get for the guitar itself. The clip spread across the internet almost immediately and kept spreading for years afterward, showing up in compilation videos, reaction channels, and discussion threads where people endlessly debated what had actually happened and why. The Guitar Man became genuinely legendary in the world of reality television moments, the kind of clip that gets passed around to people who have never even heard of hardcore porn and still manages to get a reaction every single time. But here is the part that made the whole thing even more fascinating. Nobody ever figured out who he was. He walked into that shop as a stranger, created one of the most watched moments in the show's entire history, walked back out, and returned to a completely anonymous life without leaving behind a single trace that anyone could follow. No interview, no social media account, no follow-up appearance, nothing. He became famous without a name, and that mystery followed the show long after it ended. But the next disappearance was one the audience had actually seen building for a long time. Robo, the original enforcer who vanished first. In the earliest days of Hardcore Pawn, before the show had fully found its rhythm, and before viewers had settled on their favorite characters, Brian Jackson was already doing one of the most important jobs in the building. He worked security under the name Robo, and he was one of the very first guards that audiences learned to trust as the cameras started capturing the daily reality of life inside American Jewelry and Loan. He was not a background character or a face that blended into the crowd. He was a genuine presence, someone the show leaned on during the chaotic early period when everything was still being established. Robo had a quality that made him effective on screen and useful behind the scenes at the same time. He could step into a difficult situation and bring it back under control without making things worse, which in that environment was genuinely harder than it sounds. Customers who came into the shop upset or aggressive needed someone capable of de-escalating without creating a bigger scene, and Robo handled that responsibility with a calm authority that viewers at home clearly respected and appreciated across the early seasons. Then something happened, and the details of exactly what that something was never became entirely clear to the public. Reports suggested that an incident involving another employee had led to Robo being removed from his position, though the specifics were never laid out plainly or confirmed by anyone connected to the production in any meaningful way. The show did not dedicate a scene to his exit. There was no formal explanation offered to viewers who had spent seasons watching him work, and the production simply moved forward, as though the gap he left behind was not particularly significant. He did return briefly at some point, which gave fans a moment of hope that whatever had gone wrong had been resolved, and that Robo was back for good. But that hope turned out to be short-lived. The return did not last. The disappearance became permanent, and Brian Jackson stepped away from the show and from public life in a way that left almost no footprint behind. What made Robo's situation particularly memorable was not the drama of it, because there was very little drama to speak of publicly. It was the complete absence of answers. Fans who searched for information found almost nothing, and that silence ended up being louder than any explanation could have been. He was the first major face the show lost, and he would not be the last. But the next story was different in every way, because it followed a man who had been famous long before Hardcore Pawn ever existed. Darren McCarty, the sports hero, fighting collapse. Before Darren McCarty ever walked through the doors of American Jewelry and Loan, millions of people already knew his name. He was a Detroit Red Wings legend, a four-time Stanley Cup champion, and one of the most celebrated hockey players the city had ever produced. In Detroit especially, his name carried genuine weight, the kind that comes from years of winning and from a career that had made an entire city proud. He was not some minor celebrity looking for a platform. He was a genuine sports icon, and that made his appearance on Hardcore Pawn feel surprising in a way that was difficult to ignore. But Darren did not arrive at that pawn shop from a position of comfort or stability. By the time cameras captured him there, he was going through one of the hardest stretches of his life. And the contrast between the champion people remembered and the man struggling in front of the cameras was impossible to miss. Financial problems had been building for some time, bankruptcy had entered the picture, and the addiction battles that had followed him for years were still very much a part of his daily reality. The fame and the trophies and the championship rings had not protected him from any of it. His time connected to the show was relatively brief, and he was never a core cast member in the way that the Gold family or the security guards were, but his presence created genuine moments that viewers found hard to forget. There was something about watching a man of his stature navigate that kind of visible struggle that made audiences pay attention in a different way than usual, because this was not a stranger. This was someone Detroit had cheered for across multiple championship runs. What happened after was the part of the story that genuinely mattered. Darren McCarty did not stay down. He leaned into recovery, addressed his addiction seriously, and slowly began rebuilding a life that the worst years had nearly taken from him completely.
And this is one of them. One of the favorite sons, Darren McCarty, is here, and we're pleased as punch to have you here.
The process was not quick or easy, and Darren spoke openly about his recovery journey in ways that have connected with a lot of people going through similar battles. Today, he remains active in hockey alumni circles, showing up at events and staying connected to the sport that defined his career. But his distance from the pawnshop world and from reality television generally is complete and deliberate. His comeback was one of the more genuine ones the show ever produced, but the next person never really got a comeback at all. Byron, the replacement fans barely got to know. Byron arrived at American Jewelry and Loan quietly and without any fanfare, stepping into a security role that had been left open after the Season 6 scandal surrounding Big Joe, and from the very beginning, it was clear that he was a very different kind of presence than the man he was effectively replacing. Where Big Joe had been a beloved and familiar face that viewers had spent years trusting, Byron was a stranger walking into an already established world, and the audience treated him accordingly, watching with a kind of cautious distance that he never quite managed to fully close. What Byron did have, and what quickly became his defining characteristic on the show, was a calm and consistent professionalism that the shop genuinely needed at a time when trust had taken a serious hit. He did not create drama. He did not insert himself into arguments that were not his to manage, and he showed up every day ready to do his job without making it about himself. In a building where chaos was practically part of the job description, that kind of steady reliability was not a small thing. It was exactly what the situation called for. Fans who gave him a real chance found things to appreciate about Byron. His composure under pressure, his quiet authority in difficult moments, and his ability to keep the environment manageable even when things were threatening to spiral. But the audience's affection for him never reached the level it had for the guards who came before him, partly because the show itself did not invest as heavily in building his story, and partly because the shadow of what had happened with Big Joe was still very much hanging over everything. When Hardcore Pawn was eventually canceled, Byron's connection to any kind of public profile disappeared almost immediately along with it. No interviews followed the cancellation, no appearances were made on other platforms, and no social media presence emerged to keep his name in the conversation. He had come in as a replacement, and he left as quietly as he had arrived, without the show ever really giving audiences the time or the material to form a strong attachment to him. He deserved more than the situation ever allowed him to get, and that felt like one of the quieter injustices the show left behind when it ended. But the next story was not quiet at all, because the person who came next had things to say, and he was not particularly interested in keeping them to himself. Bobby Janiec, the employee who spilled behind-the-scenes secrets. Bobby Janiec was never one of the biggest names on Hardcore Pawn, and during his time working around the shop in the later seasons, he occupied a space that most casual viewers would have struggled to pin down precisely. He was not a security guard with a memorable nickname, not a family member with a stake in the business, and not someone the cameras followed closely enough to build a fully fleshed-out character around. He was present, he was recognizable to attentive viewers, but he existed somewhere in the background of a show that already had more personalities than it always knew what to do with. What changed Bobby's relationship with public attention was not anything that happened while the cameras were rolling inside American Jewelry and Loan. It was what he chose to do after the show ended and the production wrapped up for the final time. While most former cast members went quiet or simply moved on with their private lives, Bobby took a different route and began appearing online to talk about what life behind the scenes had actually been like during his time on the show. The things he described painted a picture that was considerably more complicated than what weekly audiences had seen on their screens, touching on tensions between cast members, the way certain situations were handled off-camera, and the general atmosphere that existed inside the building when the production crew was not directly focused on any particular moment. For fans who had spent years watching and wondering how much of what they saw was genuine, Bobby's accounts offered something genuinely interesting, a perspective from someone who had been present but had never been central enough to have a strong reason to protect the show's image. The response from online audiences was engaged and curious, at least for a while, with viewers picking through what he shared and debating how much weight to give his version of events. But that kind of interest has a natural shelf life, and as the years passed and Hardcore Pawn moved further into the category of shows people remembered fondly rather than actively followed, the conversations around Bobby's revelations gradually faded, along with everything else connected to the show. He spoke up when others stayed silent, and for a brief period that made him one of the more talked-about former cast members still floating around online. But the audience moved on, and Bobby moved on with it. The next story, though, was not about fading quietly. It was about a fall so public and so dramatic that fans never forgot where they were when they watched it happen. Big Joe, the fall of the most trusted guard. Joel Shannon was not just another face in the background of Hardcore Pawn. He was the face that viewers associated with reliability, with strength, and with the kind of steady presence that made the whole operation feel safe and controlled.
Well, you can't explain, we were on Hardcore Pawn for 6 years. It changes your life, you would never...
Fans had spent seasons watching him manage difficult situations inside American Jewelry and Loan, stepping in when things got heated, keeping the environment from completely spiraling, and doing it all with a quiet authority that made him genuinely beloved by the audience that tuned in week after week. Big Joe was not just trusted by viewers at home, he was trusted by the Gold family themselves. And that trust had been built slowly and consistently over a long stretch of time. He was not someone who had arrived and immediately demanded attention or tried to make himself the center of every scene. He had earned his place through years of showing up and doing exactly what was expected of him, and that made what eventually came next feel like a genuine betrayal to everyone who had invested in him. The details of what happened were not complicated or easy to misread. Big Joe was caught stealing scrap gold from the very shop he had been trusted to protect, and the discovery did not happen quietly behind closed doors where it could be handled privately and kept away from the audience. It played out on national television, in front of the same millions of viewers who had spent years trusting him completely. And the shock of watching someone so deeply associated with loyalty and reliability exposed in that way hit the audience harder than almost any other moment the show ever produced. He was fired immediately, the arrest followed, and just like that, one of the most trusted figures the show had ever built its security around was gone. The damage was not limited to his career either, because for many viewers, the moment permanently changed how they looked back at everything they thought they had understood about the show and the people there in it. After leaving television, Big Joe reportedly moved into the trucking business, building a quieter life far removed from cameras and weekly audiences and the world that had once made him famous. No public statements came, no attempts to rehabilitate his image followed, and he simply disappeared into ordinary life and stayed there. His fall was the loudest ending the show ever produced, and nobody who watched it ever quite forgot it. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.